Hello. What's going on?
Hello, good morning. Hello, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are dialing in from.
Hi, everyone.
Hello, Pierre.
Hi, Pierre.
Hello.
Jason, do you want to continue with your introduction?
Yes, I got a little logged off, but I will start now. Hello, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to this special BOF Live event, and we're going to be talking about being Black in fashion media today. I will be your moderator along with Chantal Fernandez, our senior correspondent here at BOF. I write the race relations column, and Chantal and I will be moderating with you today. Welcome, Chantal. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Jason.
Can you hear me, everyone?
Yes.
Yeah, hi.
Fantastic. Okay, there are few reasons why we have assembled this phenomenal roster of panelists here today, and I'll break them down briefly for you. As the journalist behind the race relations column here at Business of Fashion, I am interested in telling the many untold stories bridging Black and BIPOC contribution to fashion through the ages. And this unprecedented gathering of a multi-generation of Black journalists certainly qualifies. Also, since the racial reckoning, we've had some time to reflect. We've had some time to really scrutinize this industry more closely than we ever have before, certainly as it pertains to race. And the assembled panelists here are the most qualified to speak on these issues. And finally, here at BOF, we offer a writing fellowship to a Black journalist, an effort that Chantal Fernandez here heads up, and a committee that I serve on. And frankly, guys, in vetting the candidates for this fellowship, most of these aspiring journalists just did not know of other Black journalists that came before them. And so this session is also to help fill in the gaps in the knowledge of our young talents. I mean, how can we set an agenda for the future if we fail to recognize the past? And so that is why we have assembled here today. And Chantal is going to introduce our esteemed panel of journalists. So thank you very much for joining us from wherever you are in the world today. And we're looking forward to meeting these fantastic journalists here today. Thank you. Chantal?
Hi, everyone. We're so excited to be joined by Givhan, senior critic at large for the Washington Post. Constance White, the longtime writer, editor, author, and now editorial consultant, formerly of Essence, Elle, and the New York Times. George Wayne, former Vanity Fair columnist and author of Anyone Who's Anyone, The Astonishing Celebrity Interviews, 1987 to 2017. Lindsay Wagner, editor-in-chief of The Cut and former editor-in-chief at Teen Vogue. And Pierre M. Pellet, the critic, also known as Pam Boy, and editor at Perfect Magazine. Thank you all so much for joining us today to have this conversation.
Thank you guys, really, I really appreciate it. This is an unprecedented. We have never in fact, you have not all collected in one space before to certainly speak about your experiences as Black journalists in this business of fashion. And before we hear from you, I'm just gonna tell you a little bit about my experience as a journalist in this business for the last 25 years or so. So before we hear from our panelists, I'll tell you my history. In addition to being an editor at Surface Magazine and a writer for Style.com, in the very early days of fashion and the internet, I chose to take an alternative, independent route, and I started the online magazine called JC Report. I'm sure some of the members of the audience here remember the report where it was an online magazine essentially where we covered global fashion trends. I worked outside of the power structure. I owned my voice, but I still worked in the core industry without guidance or oversight, not dissimilar to how, say, influencers are currently sort of positioned in the industry. But our panelists have worked, and some continue to work, for the large mainstream press that sets the standard in the business of fashion journalism. And that's why we want to hear from them today. Today, we'll hear about their unique experiences and their view on the industry. So guys, it's a bit of a tall order for you today, but we're gonna dive right into this. And please pick up on this strain of questions wherever you seem fit. But in learning about your experiences, I wanna know were there a set of expectations for Black journalists working in fashion media? And were you racialized along the way? Were you celebrated, or were you just tolerated in those spaces? And was your Blackness ever dimmed along the way? And amongst your ranks, was there a sense of solidarity? Did you feel that you were moving as a group? And consider this equation, and if you could identify what has changed in this equation. I hope I haven't given you too much to digest there, but I would really like for you to tackle that set of questions from whatever angle you wish. And Constance, I'm gonna start with you, if you don't mind. If you could dive into this a bit for me, speaking about your experiences as you came up through, New York Times, Essence Magazine, Elle magazines, and really in the belly of journalism in fashion over the last 2 to 3 decades.
Well, in the belly of the beast. Right? You did bring up a number of really interesting topics, Jason, for us to speak on. I'll start off with a couple of them. First of all, the solidarity. When I was coming up, there weren't as many Black journalists around as there are now. And in particular, there, to my right, thank God, was Robin. To my left, thank God, was Terry Agins. And then I also worked, when I was at Women's Wear Daily, with Agnes Kammock, Darlene Gillett-Jones, and with Jean, with Agnes's sister, Jean, who was incredible art director. And I don't think, to your point, many people know that this happened and that they have these shoulders to stand on, this person who is still around and, could be a wonderful mentor. Jean Griffin was art director at Women's Wear and at W for many years, a Black woman. And she actually went on to work at Essence. So she was there for over 2 decades at Fairchild. So just something for people to know and realize. I think I had a sense of solidarity. The reason I bring up Robin, who is here, and Terry, who's not, is because I know within me, I had a sense of solidarity and strength that I drew from seeing these 2 women, these 2 sisters, working in some of the most demanding and powerful jobs in the industry, and knowing that they would certainly understand some of the challenges that I faced, whether we talked about them or not. I always had a sense of looking out for other Black editors, other Black journalists who were working, in particular when we go to shows and events. The Essence editors were often there. The legendary Mickey Garth Taylor, who's incredible. Sandra Martin, who works behind the scenes there, and whoever the fashion editor was at the time at varying times. And with the exception of the aforementioned Agnes Calmont, because Agnes could pretty much take care of herself coming from, in terms of access. But a lot of times those editors couldn't get access. And those were some of the few times that I would step outside of my box, if you will, as a journalist, because when you walk in as a fashion journalist to any situation, when you sit before a story that you're about to do, first and foremost, you are doing it as a journalist. You're doing it as a professional. And you're not sitting down to work on a story saying, I'm a Black journalist. What should I do? I'm now entering this room. Certainly, and we can get into this later, certainly there is the sense of sometimes you have that consciousness of being the only Black person in the room or one of the few Black people in the room, but you're not walking into your professional situation with that being the first thing you're leading with. You're walking in trying to do the best job you can as a professional. And so this was an example of, I would admit that I would step outside of that to say, I knew that I had the positioning and the power working for the New York Times to say, not in a aggressive or obnoxious way, but to say, listen, this is what Essence magazine is in the United States. Let's say this was happening in Paris. Sometimes it would happen in New York. Right. They deserve to be in this room. They deserve to be in this show. You just perhaps don't understand who they are. And I wouldn't get any pushback. And not because I was Constance White, but I wouldn't get any pushback because I was representing the New York Times.
Well, Constance, I definitely want to dissect that, the sort of dual role that you illustrated in that statement. You had to step out of the box of being a journalist and play another role. We'll definitely get into that, but I want to go over to Robin now and find out from Robin if she felt that sense of responsibility to say mentor you or to offer you an open door. Did you feel a sense of responsibility, Robin, as a Black woman seeing another Black woman in that space to usher her in, to welcome her? Is there that kind of camaraderie? Was there?
Well, I wouldn't say that it was specific to race necessarily. I mean, when I started in the fashion industry or started writing about the fashion industry, I started at a mid-sized regional newspaper. And that is, I would say that there are a couple of layers there in the sense that, at the center of sort of fashion coverage are fashion magazines. And sort of outside of that are the national newspapers. And then a step even beyond that, when I started, were the regional newspapers. And I really have always considered myself to be part of journalism, not part of fashion. And perhaps that's splitting hairs, but I also think that in many ways it's also been important to my own sort of mental well-being. And, as a regional journalist, some of the big challenge was often just getting into the room simply because I was a regional journalist. And so I have an incredible amount of respect for an entire generation of women who covered the fashion industry at these mid-sized newspapers, which actually funneled a lot of people to national papers and into magazines, who opened the door for me and were really welcoming and answered all of my crazy questions and, were there to be supportive. Once I got to the Washington Post, I always sort of felt that, my responsibility is to my readers. And in making that my first responsibility, I felt that was in many ways what my way of essentially mentoring. It was by example. And I always try to make it clear that, covering the fashion industry can be challenging in part because fashion is such a kind of personal industry in what it's selling and what it's promoting. And it's very easy to internalize those things as a reporter and to take them personally. And, I hope that by example, I've shown that if you don't do that and you focus on the work, then, you can find a pathway to success.
Well, I love that analysis, Robin. But I want to bring it over to Lindsay now. Just you exist in a different time, Lindsay. You're working in a very different space, let's say. Are the rules different? Are the expectations for you different in the current climate that we exist in than, say, the scenario that Robin just illustrated of just approaching this industry as a journalist and mentoring just by doing her work? Does it feel different now for you?
I think everyone, chooses the path and how they want to do that work in their own way. And I think that just comes about organically for each person. I don't necessarily think about the rules of the fashion world or anything like that. I do think a lot about the work that has come before me and how to honor that and be respectful of that. People like Robin, Constance, Terry, all these people that we're talking about. I remember the first time I met Robin and Constance. I was so stunned. I literally don't care about any celebrity, don't care. And I remember the first time that I met both of them, like those are celebrities to me, because those are people that I've been reading for so long and have made a way for people like me and myself. And so I don't think that it's necessarily of moving in a different way because I'm from a different time, but I think I am always really concentrating on what I can do to honor those that have come before me and super grateful, honestly, but also how do we push things forward and use these platforms to make it better for the next young Lindsay and all of that. And so I think in certain ways, it's been a push and pull of that. And I think at certain points in my career, I felt like I need to do a little bit more. And so that was why then I, started Black in Fashion Council with Sandrine Charles last year, of wanting to push it further and use the platform to do a little bit more. But I think ultimately it's always about the work.
Well, George, thanks for that, Lindsay. George, I want to hear about your experiences in the corridors of Conde Nast. And your profile is distinct in that let's be honest, you're a bit of a muckraker. That was you write a column to stir up society and stir up Hollywood and fashion. And that was essentially your role. But you are a Black gay man operating in the Tina Brown space, during that time. What was expected of you?
It's looking back, I always think, what did they want me to be? Because I never even sort of like thought about all that. What was my role? What was I supposed to do? And I guess I was kind of like, as they would say about Gautier, the enfant terrible. I just basically went about doing it my way. Which was kind of sweet. I remember, you mentioned earlier that the way you started about, creating a set of your own space and not following the boundaries of journalism. Well, I could never write for the Washington Post or the New York Times because, there's a standard of formatted journalism, which I always disdain. But it was just a matter of sort of being that maverick, that rogue in a certain, in a certain say. I remember how I sort of like developed this love for journalism was being in boarding school in Jamaica, and the school nurse took a liking to me and gave me People magazine to read for the first time, and Interview magazine. And when I was reading about Andre Leontali at Interview and Bob Colachella in the column, that's basically how it began for me. I mean, I had no idea that I would still end up at Conde Nast and sort of like being sort of, you mentioned the idea about did I ever feel racialized? And I started my career at Conde Nast with Allure magazine, and that's basically where my real strong fashion part of my own brand sort of first developed. And I got the feeling when I was at Conde Nast, when I went to Linda Wells and she said, "What do you want?" Because I basically got my job by pestering Cy Newhouse, this Conde Nast Scion, and I wrote him a letter because I started, as you did, my own little thing, a little Xerox zine that I produced myself, that I write and staple and sell, a little copy shop, a little magazine shop in the West Village, in the East Village called Rome, and having the feedback and being told that, oh my God, Anna Winter just bought Rome, Cy Newhouse just bought Rome. And so I wrote him a letter, said, "Why don't you buy Rome, Mr. Newhouse?" And he wrote me back the next week. It was just shocking to think. He actually picked, those days people would write letters, and he wrote me back. He said, "I can't buy Rome, but I want you to go and talk to this woman. He's just decided to create a magazine called Allure." So I went to see Linda Wells, his first editor-in-chief, and she said, "What do you want?" I said, "I want a contract. I don't want to be here every day. I don't want to travel." She said, "Okay." And so my first assignment was to go to St. Bart's, and then of course I would do the dog and pony fashion show trips with, then I'd run into people like Constance and Terry in particular. And Robin, I really didn't know that well, but of course, there's sort of like, you walk in the room and there are a few black faces that you'd see. And it was always reassuring, and there was always warmth and love, from most of them. Andre wasn't that loving, let's be honest, Andre Leontali, but and then I kind of got the feel that as my career at Allure picked up, that they were kind of like, trying to pigeonhole me as the next Andre. I'd have to tag along with Linda to the shows, and and it was a little self-conscious to me because I didn't want to be the next Andre Leontali. I wanted to be GW, I wanted to do it way, and Andre never really helped, to be quite honest. He was in his own world. He was in the stratosphere.
Let's dive a little bit into this because, and Pam Boy, I definitely want to hear from you as well, but let's just dive a little into this for a moment because I think the audience has the question if there's camaraderie amongst these ranks. You guys have all worked at different publications, and I have to say, from what I've heard from you guys thus far, everyone seemed to have been siloed. Everyone seemed to have been siloed. Yes, Constance, you mentioned Robin's presence certainly being there and so forth, but it seemed like everyone went about their business independently. Was there not a sense of community? Was there not a sense of, we're all in this game together, that there is covert and overt racism in this industry, and that's what links us? Was there any sense of that?
There was.
You did. I never really got a sense of that. I think everyone was happy just to be in the room, to be quite honest. And it's not like knowing your place, because you can't get to that level of a magazine empire, or write on a column, or having a byline that's with some prominence without having that sense of I belong and I feel that I deserve to be here.
Can I just say that I think that there is community, but there's also individuality as well.
There was
and
both.
So
Okay.
The idea that just because you are Black, that you're going to bond with every other Black person, I think is sort of oversimplifying.
So every Black person.
The question. Yes, and you recognize certainly the Black people who are in the industry. And, and I would point out, for instance, that like Terry Agans was incredibly welcoming and supportive. And I have always joked that, if I had a great story, or a story that I thought was great, Terry would be among the first people on the telephone calling to congratulate me about a great story. And I think, Andre has always been in a really challenging position because he was the first at his level. And there were an incredible amount of expectations placed on his shoulders. But I would also say that when I started covering the fashion industry, Andre was incredibly supportive and incredibly welcoming. And when I sort of wandered over to Vogue for a short period of time, his was the first call to welcome me to the magazine. And he was beyond kind and gracious when I won the Pulitzer in a way that just went above and beyond. So I think that there are expectations that are placed upon people who are the first to break a barrier that sometimes are unfair. So that's my defense of Andre.
There's no need to defend Andre. I'm not saying Andre Leonard.
Can I also quickly say that I think that in this, if we're talking about it also in a generational difference, which I do think is important to note, of just like, obviously fashion was very different in Andre's time versus now, all of that. I do think that people don't realize that you have to, obviously, you can go up to somebody and just say like, hey, I'm a huge fan of your work, all of that. But I mean, Robin owes me nothing, like nothing, like no favor. She's incredible. She's wonderful. Same with like, and I do think that there's this idea that people don't realize that you have to earn the right to have those conversations also, and do the work also to be able to, I think, have that relationship, or be able to reach out and then respond and et cetera. Because I mean, even if we're just talking about myself, I get hundreds of messages from young people of color that want to work in fashion. It is not realistic for me to be able to answer every single message, mentor every single Black girl that reaches out to me, et cetera, and also make great work. Like, that's not realistic. And I think what, I was thinking about that because what Robin was also saying is like, that pressure is solely put on us as people of color to make the best work, but also foster the next generation, but also mentor, but also do all of these things. And so, yeah, there is going to be some kind of weeding out of people, and some of those people, yes, may be people of color, but ultimately, if you are making great work, I do think that there is a camaraderie. You may not be best friends with everybody, but there is a respect and a growth in that relationship that I think that is always there.
Oh, wow. And on that note, PamBoy, PamBoy, do we see you here?
Hey.
Oh, okay. In respect, being a part of the new generation of journalists now, in respect to what Lindsay say, I think a lot of the audience would think that there is more of a unified body amongst the core of journalists, that just being Black people, that there is a great sense of understanding and communication. But I think what's evident in this conversation is that no, people are independently going about their work. Not that they don't recognize and give a nod to to their fellow Black person, but it may not be more than that.
Yeah, I mean, me, for instance, I'm a huge fan of my friends. I'm a huge fan of everyone on this panel. I feel like it should be sat at the kids' table and not here. But I think it's super important, and it's something that we've learned to develop with my friends, just to be there for each other and to support each other. I think it's something that we expected from the people that we're looking up to when we're growing up. But like Lindsay said, they didn't really owe us anything, and to wait for someone to hold your hand and show you how the industry works, and to kind of protect you from racism or anything that would damage you psychologically is wrong. And what we kind of realized with my group of friends who are the same age as me, we support each other, and that's like Robin was saying just now, we call each other and we support each other when someone is doing something interesting, something great, or an achievement. And that sort of bond, we're trying to keep it, because it's super important when you're a minority within this industry. I studied fashion journalism at St. Martin's, and I was the only Black person in my class in my whole year. And that was really difficult because it felt that I had to do more. I had to become this annoying know-it-all, very Hermione Granger type of character, because otherwise I felt like I wouldn't be seen. And I had to be, I had to know my stuff. And now being in the industry is, kind of the same feeling. I still have to prove a lot of things, but I think most of the time it's things that I have to prove to myself, because in industry that wasn't built for me. That wasn't necessarily, the most welcoming for people who look like me and who come from, where I come from. And today I feel like there's more of a cohesive or more of a bond between my friends and people who aren't just my friends, but people who work in the industry who look like me or who don't look like me.
Thank you for that, Pam Boy. I'm sorry, was someone adding something there? And on that note, I want to move on then to the mission of journalism today, in light of what you just said, Pam Boy, about your sort of link with your peer group and essentially linked together to get work done. I mean, there's obviously a history in this, but let's talk about this lens through the BLM movement and what has transpired over the last year with the racial reckoning. How has that disrupted, how has that changed or not the mission of fashion journalism today? Of course, being Black journalists, and do Black journalists have a responsibility to address racism? And how do you separate journalism from activism? And Lindsay, you had picked up on this before, speaking of all the heavy lifting that we have to do in addition to being journalists at this time. So I also would love for you to weigh in on that. But these questions go out to the panel.
I suppose, am I going first?
Yes, go ahead, Lindsay, go ahead.
I mean, it's a lot of loaded questions. And I think that ultimately, I don't know, what we're talking about is also, I am always, yes, rooting for every Black person. And I see myself as trying to be a ladder and helping up other people of color. And I do that through my work and Black in Fashion Council. But I think that the way that I may handle a situation is very different than another person of color or another Black person. And I think that's ultimately why I think a lot of these questions, it really depends on the person and, if you can go to sleep at night and feel good about it. I always felt like, I remember I used to do these like Black girl dinners in my apartment, like Black girl and fashion dinners in my apartment. I had, been on a shoot and someone called me the N-word. And I remember that I asked different people at this dinner, like, what would you do? Like, I need this job. I'm broke. I'm already working 3 jobs on top of this job. So like, what do I do? How do I have this conversation? Because I need this job. I don't know people in fashion and I don't want them to fire me because I'm broke and I need to be here. But this doesn't sit well with me. And how I dealt with that would be very different than somebody from a previous generation, because I think that, obviously time, culture, so much has changed. So in, having conversations through different pieces and things that I've done in the past, and talking about those kinds of situations, I do think that it also is, about how you personally have felt in your own, time as a journalist and what is really important to you and how you present yourself. I also think working for a magazine can be incredibly challenging when you are the only person. And so that sense of camaraderie that you're talking about is always a desire, but it also isn't, it just hasn't really been my reality. I am usually the youngest and only Black person in a lot of spaces. And so I think that ultimately it is really hard of how do you deal with the racism, but also just focus on making the best work that you can. And through that work, ultimately trying to change the industry.
But you haven't felt a sense of you have to do more in this fight for equity? Like, have you felt that increased pressure, particularly during this period? And I'll put that out to the rest of the panelists as well.
I mean, I would just say that, you know, I am old school in the sense that I'm a journalist, I'm not an advocate. And I have incredible respect for people who are advocates and who are activists. But, you know, that's not my role. And my role is to be a reporter and to try and, you know, get as close to the truth as it is discernible. I also, you know, have a column, and so that allows me to have a point of view. But I very strongly feel that my column should be about, you know, trying to place things into a broader context and using all of my background, all of my skills in order to do that. So obviously, I'm looking at things from the point of view of a Black woman who grew up in the Midwest. So, and that it alone is an argument for why, you know, the industry needs greater diversity, because you can only speak from your point of view, and each point of view has great validity. But I don't think that I should be telling my story. I should be telling other people's stories. And, you know, in terms of the pressure to mentor and things like that, I mean, I believe that it's incumbent on everyone to be a good colleague and to, you know, set a positive example of what it means to be a professional and to do your job with integrity and to be curious and to be open-minded. And I think all of those, keeping all those things in mind, almost sort of organically means that you are welcoming and supportive to others who come into the industry. But I also think that people who come into the industry also bear a certain responsibility, which is that, you know, every room is not going to necessarily, you know, put your comfort as its first priority. And you have to find that comfort within yourself, or you have to find that comfort within your circle of friends. But you can't necessarily expect it to be, to come full-throatedly from your professional environment. And I think you also, when you are looking for mentorship, you know, it's a huge difference between saying, how do I get into an industry, as opposed to saying, you know, is there an internship program at your company? And if so, how do I apply? I mean, I think you have to be much more, you have to do research and then ask specific questions. And then people are absolutely willing to be helpful, I think. But when you just sort of throw yourself, you know, at someone's, in front of someone and say, guide me, you've given the person no real operating principle to understand where it is that you even want to be guided.
But Robin, I want to ask you this. You said that you are old school and that, you know, you are a journalist first. Now, do you think that there is a pollution amongst journalists who are, you say, more take on an activist role where they are also in this story? You say you do not want to be in this story, you do not put yourself in this story, you report. But let's speak about the integrity of the journalism then when you do put yourself in this story. Specifically, as Black people, as Black journalists, we cannot help but to be Black and cannot help but to bring our experience to that. Does that impact the journalistic integrity in your eyes?
I think everyone approaches the way that they cover the industry in their specific manner. And I think that someone who's reporting for a magazine has a somewhat different relationship to the industry, than someone who's reporting for a general interest newspaper. I think someone who has their own blog or has, their own, set of Instagram followers, or someone who runs their own publication has a completely different set of rules and obligations that they adhere to. I work for a large corporate media organization that has very specific principles related to how it does its journalism. And I respect those principles. It's one of the reasons why I enjoy working where I do. I think there are other people who might find those rules and principles to be confining and antagonistic to what it is that they would like to ultimately accomplish, or at least the way in which they would like to accomplish something. So, I think it's really an individual choice.
And Constance, I would love to hear your weigh in on this. You haven't been there to see the evolution of the profession of journalism, at least as it relates to us as Black people. And again, there's nothing set here. It's just a supposition, if you will. But if you would give me your sense of the journalism activism role, particularly as things have evolved over the last year or so.
Well, fashion does not exist outside of society. Right? Fashion exists as a part of what is going on, and fashion journalism, and journalism by itself, for that matter, exists as a part of what is going on in society. So I sit at, as Robin had said earlier, I totally agree with her, this concept of, I sit at the intersection, for me, of fashion and of journalism. I exist in those two worlds as a professional, and as two things I'm passionate about. And the two things for me intersect. And one of the industry and how Black fashion journalists operate in the industry, we're in a context which has changed to a large degree, and then in other ways has stayed the same. So for instance, digitization has totally uprooted, revolutionized, upended everything that we do as journalists and everything that we do as professionals in fashion. There are now places and spaces where people do come out and speak and are able to be advocates. And in fact, the very issues that we as individual Black fashion journalists are wrestling with, our big companies that operate in the media space are wrestling with them too. How do you operate? If you're, for example, at the New York Times now, there's a whole issue around one of their most lauded reporters who's also very active on social media. And the company is wrestling with, this is a style reporter, the company is wrestling with, how do we deal with this? Because it's creating some pushes and pulls. So I think, in summary, that we're in a moment where it's like water flowing, and you have to be flexible and you have to be responsive. And what may work in one moment may not necessarily work tomorrow. And that's a reality. One of the things that is also different that used to happen in the industry compared to today is, and I think Robin summed this up very well in saying you had the individuality and you also had the community. That is very true, because we all look at and work for companies and have an obligation to companies now and then, and that's a similarity and has not changed. If they're writing your paycheck, then yes, you have an obligation to adhere to their rules. But people also, that's why we are also in this space now in a way that we weren't back then, of talking about bringing your whole self to work, talking about Black Lives Matter, which has come totally to our doorsteps in fashion in a way it never did before. We had groups back then, but those groups were quiet, behind the scenes, because they had to be. No one was checking for anyone coming into their office. And let's just use very quickly, for example, in microcosm, what happened with O.J. Simpson, right? People with the O.J. Simpson trial, I think that's a great microcosm when we had, which is in what's happening broadly speaking now with Black Lives Matter. You had the Black people watching in real time in newsrooms and companies, not just newsrooms, but since we're talking about journalism, but to my point, nothing happens outside of the greater context of society, right? You had Black people looking at this, and by and large, because it was happening in real time when people were at work, and on television, by the way, not on the internet. And the Black people had one reaction internally and couldn't voice it, right? And then the white people had another reaction. And this is and everyone sort of kept it, the Black people kept it to themselves. Now in the Black Lives Matter moment, Black people are having one reaction, white people are having another, but now we're all talking about it. Black people feel free to speak about it. In your workplaces, it's coming up in our workplaces, it's coming up on the internet, and we're all seeing a lot of the same thing, and so on and so forth. So I think those are important things which are impacting Black fashion journalists, which there's change, but there's also things that remain the same.
Well, I want to take this over to PamBoy actually, and ask you to address what Constance spoke about, bringing your full self to work, opinions and all. How does that play out as a young journalist now? Essentially relatively starting out his career in the field. Is it the same set of principles, or is vastly different?
I mean, for my case, I had to bring myself into it. I remember when I was looking for jobs after graduating, and I would send articles and I wouldn't get a reply, or, people would, tell me that I needed to intern in order to get an internship, which to me was always kind of weird. But then I just came to realize that, the power of the internet is putting yourself out there. I don't necessarily love it, but I realized that it was part of, if I wanted my voice to matter and to be heard, I would have to do it. And to me, having, a journalist hat on is similar as having an activist hat on. I feel like no journalism is, no journalism is unbiased, and I feel like there's always something that you bring into your message and what you're trying to say, and I've had I had to do it. I had to do it because it became to me clear that if I didn't do that, people wouldn't necessarily listen to what I had to say, especially in the past year or so. I feel like because I was Black and because my opinions, are what they are, people seem to care more about what I had to say regarding fashion in general, only because the industry opened up a little bit more. People were very excited all of a sudden to hear about Black voices and what they had to say. And if I didn't put myself forward and put myself, so to speak, into my work so much, I don't think people would be interested in what I have to say.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for that, PamBoy. And unfortunately, we're going to have to be winding down this session. So I do want to take a bit of time to get from you sort of the future look on the industry. How can fashion make space for more Black voices? And I want to add on this question from one of our viewers out there, Dwight Young. He says, how can a recent Black college graduate enter and start their career in the fashion industry? And that may seem like a general question, but based on what we've heard from the panelists today, everyone has had a very singular path. They have their own way of working. So I find that to be an important question considered of what you guys just delivered this morning. So please, if you could elaborate on that for me, that'd be great. So how can we make space for more Black voices in the industry?
I mean, oh, sorry, go for it.
I just think one has to sort of think that what you bring to the table is completely new and novel and original, and never be afraid to follow your mindset, your thought process. And if you have an opinion, you have an opinion. I think the whole notion of journalism versus activism, opinion matters more than anything now in the space of fashion writing and everything else in journalism, I think. So I just think you have to look at it and not whether, people are going to consider you shrill or, a troublemaker because you have an opinion on the subject of the day, which at this point in time seems to be the Black-white disconnect and the whole notion of racism in the workspace, not only in fashion, but everywhere else. And also think about the fact that, people in fashion are notoriously bitchy. They're the worst. Let's be real about it.
No.
Well, that's just my opinion, okay? It can be a notoriously very sketchy, bitchy environment, and let's deal with that. It's a fact.
Right.
It's a
And
fact.
clubbing,
Yeah,
the clubbiness.
very cliquey, very cliquey.
The clubbiness
And-
hurts Black people.
Yes, I agree, 100%. But at the end of the day, it's about being brave enough. You have to be brave enough and confident enough in your abilities and what you think that your opinion really does matter and holds some weight.
And
I
George,
do that every day.
do you think the climate is more fertile than ever for such a position, for being an opinionist in this space?
Yes, I do. I certainly think so. But I've been noticing, for instance, all these major corporate companies, the Gucci's and the LVMHs, appointing these diversity officers, the big titles. But are they making a difference? I would love to know what everyone else on the panel thinks about these diversity jobs that are being doled out left and right. Is it just an act, or is it really something that you think has some resonance?
Well, I think that there's a whole conversation in that for sure, George, that we certainly would love to have at another time. But I would like to hear from a couple more of the panelists about sort of your view on the future for Black voices in fashion.
I would like to make a very strong pitch for fact-based reporting. I think that it's
I completely agree.
Imagine that.
While I certainly obviously have my opinions and I have reviewed my share of shows, I do think that what is rarer and because it's rarer, that much more valuable are those people who can really report and who can tell stories that are rooted in fact and not solely their hot take on something. And I would also like to make a pitch for civility. I don't think that fashion has to be bitchy, and I don't think that you have to be bitchy in order to succeed. I like to think that I haven't been, and I certainly feel that the people that have been supportive of me and who have been my cheerleaders and who I tremendously admire would not be described that way. I think I have incredible respect for Lindsay and what she has accomplished. And I think that she is one of the most civil people I've ever met.
Thank you.
Anyone, any final notes on what the future looks like?
Yes, I would like to summarize by saying that what is necessary to the specific person who asked a question and then to anyone who would listen, I think what is necessary for a Black journalist in fashion to succeed and have a satisfying career is the same thing that's necessary for a white journalist to succeed and have a satisfying career, adding to that a strength, whether it's a strength of purpose or an inner strength, and reaching out to mentors. The person may be a stranger, you can get to know them, because you do, as a Black person, just again, a Black person in any area, you need that something extra to deal with racism, both real and perceived. A good Black fashion journalist, a good white fashion journalist, you have to have a nose for the story. You have to have good fundamentals of journalism, a nose for the story, fundamental reporting skills, accuracy. You have to have good research and interviewing skills, and you have to have good writing, and you need to know your subject, in this case, fashion. And so I think you get those things down, whether you do it in an academic setting, you also need the real life experience. I think that's where the focus should be. And you can really have, I totally enjoy my career and my work, despite the challenges, which are real for Black fashion journalists. But despite those challenges, I love what I do. And I think anybody, if they have the passion and interest in it, can have an incredible career in fashion journalism.
And on that note, guys, I feel like this is a sliver, a fraction of a much bigger conversation to be had. Sure, I've never spoken to all of you like this, and this was wonderful. Thank you so much for imparting all this amazing information. I would definitely love to speak to all of you at another time in the future. I want to thank our audience for joining us today. Thank you, BOF, for this platform to speak to this wonderful roster of panelists. And please join me next week in the telling of more stories about Black contributors to fashion. I'll be talking to Misa Hilton, the stylist Misa Hilton. So please join us next week, and we'll announce that time over the course of the week. But again, thank you, Robin. Thank you, George. Thank you, Pam Boy. Thank you, Constance. And thank you, Lindsay and Chantal. This was really great. I feel like I want to go on for another 2 hours.
Thank you, Jason. Thanks for having me.
Jason.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Wonderful. It's good seeing you.